Then there's this scene where he walks out onto the field that he'd played football on,
Yes.
and he's just remembering that period.
On our way to California in the morning, the big vacation, the whole family, Wally World.
Wally World, very exciting one.
There was a time when Chevy Chase made America laugh so hard, people assumed he must have been just as charming off camera. Comedy was cool, Chevy was colder, and somehow the formula worked. He didn't tell jokes, he performed arrogance like it was a sport. Audiences loved it, Hollywood tolerated it. Co-stars, not so much. The strange part isn't that Chevy became a star. The strange part is that Hollywood spent decades trying to pretend he wasn't a problem. He punched up, punched down, and sometimes punched the very scripts that made him famous. And still, the studios kept calling. Because talent that volatile is dangerous, but talent that iconic is profitable. But here's the part nobody warns you about. When a comedian builds a career on being the smartest guy in the room, sooner or later, the room starts testing the theory. By the time fans realized their favorite funny man wasn't actually joking, the joke wasn't funny anymore, and somehow, the punchline kept getting darker. The stories weren't rumors, they were eyewitness accounts. From cast members, directors, writers, people who didn't need attention, they just needed distance. The legend of Chevy Chase didn't collapse in one scandal, it collapsed in a pattern. A long, uncomfortable pattern that forces you to ask the real question. What happens when the guy who taught a generation how to laugh forgets how to make people feel good? Comedy is a strange currency. It buys affection, attention, and forgiveness, often in dangerous proportions. Chevy Chase figured that out early. Before he ever became a household name, before the movies, before Saturday Night Live turned him into the kind of celebrity that only television could invent, he already understood the power of laughing at the world while standing slightly above it. He wasn't the class clown, he was the class critic. Funny, but with an attitude that suggested he was grading the room while entertaining it. That was the first Chase paradox. He didn't break in because he was lovable, he broke in because he was undeniable. America in the late 70s was obsessed with a new kind of fame. Personalities who didn't behave like Hollywood's polite mannequins. They wanted wit with an edge, humor with teeth, confidence that bordered on arrogance. Chevy Chase arrived like an answer to a question nobody had asked yet. What if the funniest guy in the room didn't care what anyone thought of him? And for a minute, that was thrilling. SNL turned him into a meteor. He wasn't just a cast member, he was the prototype. The first breakout star. The first "I'm leaving for movies" moment in a franchise that would later turn that into a tradition. Chevy didn't just leave SNL, he left it like a man exiting a party he believed he had improved simply by attending. Audiences saw brilliance, writers saw chaos, cast saw ego, Hollywood saw money, and money, not talent, is what always decides who gets forgiven and who doesn't. But here's where the second Chase paradox sneaks in. The same arrogance that made Chevy Chase hilarious on screen made him unbearable off it. And when someone's comedic persona is built on being sharper than everyone, you start wondering what that sharpness feels like when you're standing directly in front of it. Stories from those years don't come from tabloids or anonymous sources close to the situation. They come from people who were there, people who didn't need clout, people who were busy building a new American comedy institution and suddenly realized one of its brightest stars was also one of its biggest headaches. The thing nobody expected was that Chevy's attitude wasn't an act. There was no off switch, no buffer, no separation between the persona and the person. He was the bit. On stage, backstage, after party, interview, set. It was the same. Some actors hide behind characters. Chevy hid inside the persona that made him famous, as if living outside it would be admitting he wasn't actually better than everyone else. And maybe that's why audiences adored him. Arrogance without consequence looks like confidence from far away. But proximity ruins illusions. And SNL was proximity. As the sketches got better and the show got bigger, Chevy got meaner. Not in a dramatic villain way, in a quiet, condescending, "Why are you even here?" kind of way that slowly chips at relationships until humor stops feeling collaborative and starts feeling like combat. Fame has rules. One of them: the room will tolerate your personality only as long as your performance compensates for it. In Chevy's case, The performance compensated for a long time. Longer than it should have. There's a moment audiences never witness. The moment when insiders stop being impressed and start being tired. With Chevy, that moment arrived quietly, like a whisper turning into a complaint, turning into a pattern. Patterns are more devastating than scandals. Scandals are loud and easy to move on from. Patterns are quiet and impossible to ignore. And Chevy Chase had a pattern. It showed up in rehearsals, in read-throughs, in arguments where punchlines turned into personal attacks. It appeared in disagreements that should have been creative but slid into ego wars. It appeared in the way he treated people, not as collaborators, but as props in a universe where he was central and irreplaceable. For audiences, this era was golden. For Chevy, it was victory lap. For Hollywood, it was proof. For the people closest to him, it was survival. The industry waited for the meltdown. The big dramatic moment where Chevy would say or do something that would finally shatter the illusion. But the explosion never came. It wasn't a collision. It was erosion. Movies discovered him next. Studios realized the arrogance translated beautifully on screen. Characters written as borderline jerks, egomaniacs, or lovable narcissists fit him too well to be coincidence. It wasn't acting, it was extraction. Hollywood mined the persona and monetized it. Foul Play, Caddyshack, Fletch, National Lampoon's Vacation, all hits, all iconic, all playing the same guy with microscopic variations. Chevy Chase didn't diversify, Hollywood didn't ask him to, and audiences didn't want him to. This is the part in a typical Hollywood arc where the star becomes a legend and the persona becomes legacy. But Chevy's story refused the template. Comedy has a hidden complication. It ages faster than the comedian. The audience grows, culture shifts, and what once looked sharp now looks abrasive. What looked confident now looks cruel. What looked fearless now looks insecure. And the persona that once felt magnetic starts repelling as understanding replaces nostalgia. For Chevy, the cultural shift exposed something people hadn't noticed before. He wasn't improvising arrogance, he was fueled by it. The fans didn't mind. They were too busy laughing. Hollywood didn't mind. It was too busy counting. But the people who worked with him, they minded a lot. And eventually, those were the people who started talking. Not out of revenge, out of fatigue. Because the real twist in the Chevy Chase story isn't that he was hated. It's that so many people liked him first. You can only rethink a celebrity when you liked them enough to not question them in the beginning. Chevy Chase earned that luxury. And eventually, he lost it. Not in one blow, but in 1,000 small cuts no audience ever saw happening. What made Chevy fascinating wasn't just the rise. It was how invisible the cost of that rise looked from the outside. The brilliance of comedy is that it hides pain and cruelty better than any other genre. You can package hostility as wit, insecurity as sarcasm, bitterness as punchlines, and the audience will applaud without realizing they're clapping for a defense mechanism. But defense mechanisms have side effects, and Chevy Chase's side effects usually had names. Bill Murray was one of them. The public version of that clash always gets reduced to a few headlines and a backstage fight during SNL's golden era. But backstage fights don't happen out of nowhere. They happen when two brilliant but combustible forces operate in a space that rewards ego more than empathy. Both men were funny. Both were stars. But only one carried arrogance like oxygen. And that's the uncomfortable part, because audiences love to debate who started it, who was right, who was wrong, as if art is a courtroom and comedy is a moral contest. But the truth wasn't about right or wrong, it was about compatibility. Chevy Chase's comedic approach demanded the room adjust to him. Bill Murray demanded nobody get away with that. The collision was inevitable. Not because Hollywood needed drama, but because Chevy had spent too long being the most important person in every room. And the universe eventually sends someone who doesn't care. But Murray wasn't the only one. He was simply the first public reminder that Chevy Chase didn't play well with others, at least not for long. Directors began noticing the pattern in different packaging. Some saw defiance, some saw resistance, some saw insecurity disguised as superiority. Others saw a man who believed he was too talented to be directed. And in a way, he was. Chevy had that rare comedic instinct that made timing look like a birthright. But instinct without humility becomes tyranny. And on film sets, tyranny never ages well. Still, the industry tolerated him. Because talent always buys extra time. Every delay, every argument, every sarcastic comment, every verbal jab. It all got absorbed into the budgets because the studio executive's calculator didn't measure stress, only box office returns. And the returns justified everything. For a while. The irony was that Chevy Chase didn't seem to understand he was running out of credit. Fame makes people believe the room is permanent. In reality, the room rotates. New faces replace old ones, new talent replaces old formulas, and new comedians arrive without the baggage of being difficult. By the 90s, the cultural shift had become visible. Comedy was changing, audiences were changing, Hollywood was changing, but Chevy wasn't. Where others evolved, softened, diversified, experimented, Chase remained fixed in an orbit where he was the sun and everyone else was catch-up material. That stubborn loyalty to his own persona might have been admirable if the persona hadn't begun aging badly. The biggest crack in the illusion didn't come from a scandal, a lawsuit, or an exposé. It came from something simpler. Time. Time erodes nostalgia by forcing comparison. And comparison is lethal when new generations enter the audience who have no emotional attachment to your early triumphs. To a kid watching TV in the 2000s, Chevy Chase wasn't the legend from Vacation Fletch or SNL's Prime, he was just another older celebrity. And older celebrities don't get forgiven for arrogance the way rising stars do. Then came Community. To understand how devastating that chapter was for Chevy's legacy, you need to understand the math Hollywood does when it gives someone a latent career role. A comeback role isn't just a job, it's a reconciliation attempt. It's the industry saying, one last chance, show us you can play nice. Community was that olive branch, and once again, the fans loved it first. Chevy Chase as Pierce Hawthorne was perfect casting. A sarcastic, outdated, politically incorrect relic trapped in a modern world that had moved on without him. The humor landed because it wasn't just written, it was true. But here's the twist. The role that felt like self-aware satire quickly turned into another battlefield. Cast and crew stories emerged, not from tabloids, but from interviews, commentaries, Q&A panels, and set accounts that all seemed to echo the same sentiment. Working with Chevy Chase was hard. Joel McHale put it bluntly. Donald Glover revealed the sharper edges. Writers described moments that were funny for the audience, but exhausting for the room. Chevy didn't just struggle with the character. He struggled with the environment. An environment that expected collaboration, adaptation, and vulnerability. Qualities comedy had never forced him to develop because his persona had been enough. But personas don't survive generational shifts intact. They have to evolve or they calcify. Chevy's calcified, and calcification has a tragic texture to it. It's not scandalous, it's not thrilling, it's heartbreaking. Because the Pierce Hawthorne arc wasn't fiction, it was prophecy. The saddest part wasn't that Chevy Chase became hard to work with. The saddest part was that he didn't seem to notice the world had stopped asking him to work at all. Fans didn't abandon Chevy Chase because of a scandal. They abandoned him because there was nothing left to admire except nostalgia. And nostalgia can only carry a legend so far before reality starts asking for receipts. Hollywood is full of villains and full of heroes. Chevy Chase was neither. He was the rare third category. The legend who became a cautionary tale not because of what he did once, but because of what he kept doing long after the world stopped laughing. The fascinating thing about Chevy Chase isn't that he made people angry. It's that he made the wrong people angry, the people who actually wrote the stories, funded the shows, cast the roles, and shaped the narratives. Hollywood isn't a meritocracy, it's an ecosystem. And ecosystems don't need to punish predators, they just need to stop feeding them. When the ecosystem stopped feeding Chevy, there was no announcement, no backlash, no headline. Just silence. Silence is fame's way of retiring someone without ceremony. The public didn't see the retirement, they just saw less of him. That's how legacy erosion works in Hollywood. Not through cancellation, but through quiet displacement. New, funnier, younger, more likable personalities took the same roles the old guard once monopolized. Comedy evolved into vulnerability, into relatability, into self-deprecation and cultural awareness. Chevy came from a brand of humor where the joke was always on someone else. That brand didn't die, it just became expensive. Too expensive for an era that now required empathy as an ingredient in entertainment. But empathy wasn't a skill Chevy built. Why would he? He came from a generation where comedy was war and the punchline was ammunition. You hit hard, fast, and without apology. The audience clapped if you won, and nobody asked who you wounded. People forget that comedians aren't born, they're engineered, through childhood insecurity, social friction, awkwardness, or survival mechanisms. The difference is in how they weaponize those ingredients. Some comedians weaponize humor to connect. Others weaponize humor to dominate. Chevy Chase was a dominator. Not because he was malicious, but because dominance was the only strategy comedy rewarded in his era. And strategies rarely evolve when they keep working. But strategies that ignore evolution eventually pay a price. When Community collapsed for him, that price became visible. Fans, creators, critics, and younger comedians finally had a common conclusion. Chevy Chase was funny, but he was not good company. And in entertainment, company matters more than talent long-term. Hollywood forgives failure if you're pleasant. It forgives mediocrity if you're collaborative. It forgives scandal if you're profitable. But it rarely forgives exhaustion. Chevy exhausted people. The most uncomfortable layer of his legacy isn't the arrogance or the cruelty, it's the loneliness. Because ego isn't a wall celebrities build to keep others out. It's a wall they build to convince themselves they don't need anyone in. But walls are expensive to maintain. And at some point, the effort becomes the prison. Fans didn't want this ending for Chevy Chase. They wanted the legend version. The version from Vacation, Fletch, and SNL. The version that reminded them of Thanksgiving reruns, holiday marathons, and the kind of movies entire families could watch together without anyone checking their phones. Nostalgia is protective. It shields celebrities long after reality catches up. That's why people didn't cancel Chevy Chase. They hesitated to admit they didn't like him anymore. Disappointment hurts more when it's earned through love instead of contempt. Chevy Chase was loved first. So the betrayal felt personal. But betrayal wasn't the right word. Disillusionment was. Disillusionment is when affection meets information. And information won. What makes the Chevy Chase story almost mythic isn't that he fell from grace. It's that he never understood grace was part of the job. Comedy is grace. The irony is that the people Chevy hurt the most weren't the ones who disliked him. They were the ones who respected him. Donald Glover spoke about Chevy with a kind of tragic compassion. Not mockery, not vengeance, just observation. The younger cast saw not a villain, but an artifact. A relic from a world where comedy ran on aggression instead of empathy, and masculinity ran on performance instead of honesty. Generational shifts are unforgiving. They don't argue, they just move on. Chevy didn't move with them. The more Hollywood evolved, the more he calcified into the persona that once made him relevant. Like a singer refusing to learn new songs because the old ones once filled stadiums. But stadiums move on too. That's the part people rarely acknowledge about fame. Chevy Chase wasn't canceled. He was outgrown. And being outgrown is a far more devastating ending for a legend than being attacked. Attack creates martyrdom. Being outgrown creates irrelevance. Irrelevance is Hollywood's harshest punishment because it doesn't require anger, only indifference. But the final piece of this story is the most unexpected one. Despite everything, the fans never fully let go. Because nostalgia is a stubborn negotiator, it keeps trying to rewrite endings long after the story is finished. To this day, people revisit Caddyshack, Fletch, and the Vacation films not to relive Chevy Chase, but to relive who they were while watching him. That's the secret no documentary ever admits. We don't love celebrities for themselves, we love them for who we became in the moments we watched them shine. The tragedy is when the shine fades and we're forced to meet the human behind the icon. And sometimes that human is far less lovable than the character who immortalized them. Hollywood understood the math better than fans did. Studios knew when to distance themselves. Shows knew when to recast. Writers knew when to vent. The audience just kept wondering why the funny guy disappeared. Disappearance is rarely accidental in this business. It's curated, negotiated, and quietly agreed upon. No studio wants to openly retire a legend. It's bad optics. But they don't have to. They just stop calling. And if calls stop long enough, retirement becomes the default. Chevy's disappearance didn't trigger outrage because nobody realized it was happening until it was already done. By the time fans started asking, "Where's Chevy Chase?" the answer had already settled in, somewhere between nostalgia and irrelevance. But irrelevance doesn't hit a legend the way it hits a newcomer. Newcomers fear being forgotten. Legends fear being reinterpreted. And reinterpretation is what finally caught up to Chevy, not through cancel culture, but through human culture. New generations don't inherit fandom blindly. They rewatch old films with modern eyes and new ethics. They ask uncomfortable questions older fans didn't think to ask. They evaluate legends without the emotional bias of having grown up with them. When younger audiences examined Chevy Chase, they didn't see the same icon everyone once celebrated. They saw a different archetype. Context is deadly because it doesn't accuse, it explains. And once something is explained, it's harder to romanticize. Yet even in that reinterpretation, Chevy remained uniquely fascinating. Because unlike many fallen celebrities, he didn't build his legacy on purity, morality, or humility. He built it on edge. And edges naturally cut both ways. If you strip away the nostalgia, the pattern, and the ego, you're left with a man who mastered one of the rarest comedic skills. Looking back now, it becomes obvious Chevy Chase was never meant to be universally loved. He was meant to be magnetic, and magnets don't attract everything, they attract selectively, and they repel with equal force. The people who adored Chevy adored him deeply. The people who worked with him endured him deeply. And the people discovering him now analyze him deeply. 3 generations, 3 reactions, 1 legacy. Some argue Chevy Chase became bitter. Others argue he was always bitter and fame simply amplified it. Chevy hit superstardom before emotional maturity became a requirement in Hollywood. He never had to evolve because evolution is a survival skill for people who aren't winning. Winners rarely adapt until the winning stops. When the winning stopped, adaptation never arrived. Only stories did. Stories from co-stars, stories from writers, stories from directors, stories from comedians who admired the craft but feared the man. These stories didn't cancel Chevy Chase, they contextualized him. And context reshapes fandom more effectively than outrage ever could. You can hate a villain, you can forgive a hero. It's the complicated figures who change you. Chevy Chase is complicated. Complicated enough to make you laugh at clips you've seen dozens of times, while simultaneously questioning how much damage humor can cause when wielded without restraint. Complicated enough to remind you that genius and likability don't always coexist. Complicated enough to prove that talent wins the beginning of a career, but temperament wins the rest. In the end, the most haunting line in Chevy Chase's story isn't spoken by him or by anyone who worked with him. It's spoken quietly by posterity. What could he have been if collaboration mattered as much as charisma? It's not an insult. It's a lament. Because despite everything, despite the arrogance, the conflicts, the abrasiveness, and the legendary difficulty, the world never wished Chevy Chase were less talented. They just wished he had been easier to love. And that's the twist nobody saw coming. The fans didn't rethink liking Chevy Chase because they stopped laughing. They rethought it because they finally understood the cost of the laughter. And once you understand the cost, innocence leaves the room. But nostalgia stays. And nostalgia is stubborn. And in the memories of a generation who genuinely believed he made everything funnier. They weren't wrong, they were just early in the story. Because the story didn't end with applause. It ended with a question. Was Chevy Chase the joke or the punchline? For decades, the answer was obvious. Now, it depends on who you ask.